James in particular, who's a kind of Christian communist 16-year-old, I think would be completely horrified. I remember when he was an adorable fellow of about 10, driving him to school one day, and he said to me, "Dad, you know, it's really fantastic in our family. It's really great that you and I spend so much time together in the inner city." So I drove around thinking, okay, so it's very nice that you would feel that, James. How do you mean? You know, where in the inner city do we go? And he said, well, you know, the National Concert Hall and the Gay Theatre. So I'm not going to say much about this piece. I loved William Trevor's work. It meant so much to me when I was the age that my sons are now, but it still does. All I will say about the piece is that great writers sometimes know things that they don't know. What I mean is that there's sometimes a strange longevity in their work, so that a piece can be absolutely and profoundly about the time at which it was written, but it can also be absolutely about now. So Julian and I have been chatting over the last few weeks about what piece I would choose to read, and I chose the piece about 10 days ago. It is a piece that touches on things that have been in the newspapers this week, about Ireland and England, and about terrorism and the conditions within which terrorism becomes possible, and all of that. But as ever with William Trevor, when you try to reduce his work to its themes, you do reduce it very profoundly. So I'm just going to read it. And I'm going to read it for my son James, who this evening is 4,000 miles away at school in Louisiana, and he's made himself a beloved wife and Marie is here tonight, so proud on a number of occasions, on stage in this very room. So I will read the story in his absence before James send it out across the Atlantic. So this is by William Trevor, and it's called Another Christmas. Another Christmas. You always looked back, she thought. You looked back at other years, other Christmas cards arriving, the children younger. There was the year Patrick had cried, disliking the holly she was decorating the living room with. There was the year Bridget had got a speck of coke in her eye on Christmas Eve and had to be taken to the hospital at Hammersmith in the middle of the night. There was the first year of their marriage, when she and Dermot were still in Waterford. And ever since they'd come to London, there was the presence on Christmas Day of their landlord, Mr. Joyce, and a man whom they had watched becoming elderly. She was middle-aged now, with touches of grey in her curly dark hair, a woman known for her cheerfulness, running a bit to fat. Her husband was the opposite, thin and seeming ascetic, with more than a hint of the priest in him, a good man. Will we get married, Nora? He'd said one night in the Tara Ballroom in Waterford, the 6th of November 1953. The proposal had astonished her. It was his brother Ned, heavy and fresh-faced, a different kettle of fish altogether, whom she'd been expecting to make it. Patiently, he held a chair for her while she strung paper chins across the room from one picture rail to another. He warned her to be careful about attaching anything to the electric light. He still held the chair while she put sprigs of holly behind the pictures. He was cautious by nature and alarmed by little things, particularly anxious in case she fell off chairs. He'd never mount a chair himself to put up decorations or anything else. He'd be useless at it in his opinion, and it was his opinion that mattered. He'd never been able to do a thing about the house. But it didn't matter, because since the boys had grown up, they'd attended to whatever she couldn't manage herself. You wouldn't dream of remarking on it. He was the way he was, considerate and thoughtful in what he did do, teetotal, clever, full of fondness for herself and for the family they reared, full of respect for her also. Isn't it remarkable how quick it comes round, Nora, he said while he held the chair. Isn't it no time since last year? No time at all, she said. Though a lot happened in the year, Nora. An awful lot happened. 2 of the pictures she decorated were scenes of Waterford. the keys, and a man driving sheep past the Bank of Ireland. Her mother had given them to her, taking them down from the hall of the farmhouse. There was a picture of the Virgin and Child, and other, smaller pictures. She placed her last sprig of holly, a piece with berries on it, above the Virgin's halo. "I'll make a cup of tea," she said, descending from the chair and smiling at him. "A cup of tea would be great, Nora," he said. The living room, containing 3 brown armchairs and a table with upright chairs around it, and a sideboard with a television set on it, was crowded by this furniture, and seemed even smaller than it was because of the decorations that had been added. On the mantelpiece, above a built-in gas fire, Christmas cards were arrayed on either side of an ornate green clock. The house was in a terrace in Fulham. It had always been too small for the family, but now that Patrick and Brendan no longer lived there, things were easier. Patrick had married a girl called Pearl 6 months ago, almost as soon as his period of training with the Midland Bank had ended. Brendan was training in Liverpool with a firm of computer manufacturers. The 3 remaining children were still at school, Bridget at the nearby convent, Cathal and Tom at the Sacred Heart Primary. But Patrick and Brendan had moved out of the room they'd shared always, had become Bridget's. Until then, Bridget had slept in her parents' room. She'd have to return there this Christmas because Brendan would be back for 3 nights. Patrick and Pearl would just come for Christmas Day. They'd be going to Pearl's people in Croydon on Boxing Day, Stephen's Day, as Nora and Dermot always called it, in the Irish manner. "It'll be great having them all," he said. "A family again, Nora." "Will you have biscuits with your tea?" she asked. "I have a packet of Nice." He said he would, thanking her. He was a meter reader with North Thames Gas, a position he'd held for 21 years, ever since he had emigrated. In Waterford, he'd worked as a clerk in the customs, not earning very much and not much caring for the stuffy, smoke-laden office he shared with half a dozen other clerks. He had come to England because Nora had thought it was a good idea, because she'd always wanted to work in a London shop. She'd been given a job in Dickens and Jones, in the household linens department, and he'd been taken on as a meter reader, cycling from door to door, remembering the different houses and where the meters were situated in each, being agreeable to householders. All of it suited him from the start. He devoted time to thought, what he wrote about, and in particular to religious matters. Dermot didn't work on a Monday afternoon. It was convenient now that they'd have an hour or 2 alone together, because there was the matter of Mr. Joyce to bring up. Not that she wanted to bring it up, but it couldn't be just left there. "The cup that cheers," he said, breaking a biscuit in half. Deliberately she put off raising the subject she had in mind. She watched him nibbling the biscuit and then dropping 3 heaped spoons of sugar into his tea and stirring it. He loved tea. The first time he'd ever taken her out to the Savoy Cinema in Waterford, they'd had tea afterwards in the cinema cafe, and they talked about the film and about people they knew. He'd come to live in Waterford from the country, from the farm his brother had inherited, quite close to her brother's farm. He reckoned he had settled, he told me that night. Waterford wasn't sensational, but it suited him in a lot of ways. "Did we get a card from Father Jack yet?" he inquired, referring to a distant cousin, a priest in Chicago. "Not yet," she said, "but it's always on the late side, Father Jack's. It was February last year." She sipped her tea, sitting in one of the other brown armchairs on the other side of the gas fire. And it was pleasant being there alone in the decorated room, the green clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the Christmas cards, the dusk gathering outside. She smiled and laughed, taking another biscuit while he lit a cigarette. "Isn't this great?" she said. "A bit of peace for ourselves." Solemnly he nodded. "Peace comes dropping slow," he said, and she knew he was quoting from some book or another. Quite often he said things she didn't understand. "Peace and goodwill," he added, and she understood that all right. He tapped the ash from his cigarette into an ashtray which was kept for his use beside the gas fire. All his movements were slow. He was a slow thinker, even though he was clever. They talked about Bridget and Cathal and Tom. When they came in from the cinema, they would only just have time to change their clothes before setting out again for the Christmas party at Bridget's convent. It's a big day for them, he said. Let them lie on in the morning, Nora. They could lie in forever, she said, laughing in case there might seem to be harshness in this recommendation. With Christmas excitement running high, the less she heard from him, the better. Did you get Cathal the gadgets he wanted? Chemistry stuff, a set in a box. You're great the way you manage, Nora. She denied that. She poured more tea for both of them. She said then, as casually as she could, Mr. Joyce won't come. I am not counting on him for Christmas Day. He hasn't failed us yet, Nora. He won't come this year. She smiled through the gloom at him. I think we'd best warn the children about it. But sure, where would he go if he didn't come here? Where'd he get his dinner? Lions used to be open in the old days. No, he'd never do that. The Bulrush Cafe has a turkey dinner advertised, she said. No, Mr. Joyce wouldn't go to a cafe, he said. So no one could go into a cafe on their own on Christmas Day. He won't come here, dear, she said. And it had to be said. It was no good just pretending, laying a place for the old man on an assumption that had no basis to it. Mr. Joyce would not come, because Mr. Joyce last August had ceased to visit them. Every Friday night he used to come for a cup of tea and a chat, to watch the 9 o'clock news with me. Every Christmas Day he bought carefully chosen presents for the children, chocolates and nuts and cigarettes. He'd given Patrick and Pearl a radio as a wedding present. I think he'll come all right, Dermot said. I think maybe he hasn't been too well, God help him. It's a great age, Laura. No, he hasn't been ill, Dermot, she said. Every Friday, Mr. Joyce had sat there in the third of the brown armchairs, watching the television, his bald head inclined so that his good ear was closer to the screen. He was tallish, rather bent now, frail and bony, with a modest white moustache. In his time he had been a builder, which was how he had come to own property in Fulham, a self-made man who had never married. And there had never been any difficulties over the house. They considered that he was fair in his dealings with them. They were his tenants and his friends. When it seemed that the Irish had bombed English people to death in Birmingham and Guildford, he did not cease to arrive every Friday evening and on Christmas Day. The bombings were discussed after the news, the Tower of London bomb, the bomb in the bus, and all the other bombs. Maniacs, Mr. Joyce said, and nobody contradicted him. Now he would never forget the children, Nora, Dermot said. Not at Christmas time. His voice addressed her from the shadows. She felt the warmth of the gas fire reflected in her face, and knew if she looked in a mirror she'd see that he was quite flushed. No wife could have a better husband, yet in the manner of Mr. Joyce, he was so long it almost frightened her. Is it tomorrow I call in for the turkey? He said. She nodded, hoping he'd ask her if anything was the matter, because as a rule she never just nodded in reply to a question. But he didn't say anything. He stubbed his cigarette out. He asked if there was another cup of tea in the pot. Dermot, she said, would you take something round to Mr. Joyce? A message, is it? I have a tartan tie for him, she said. But would you not just give it to him on the day, Nora, like you always do? He spoke softly, still insisting. She shook her head. It was all her fault. If she hadn't said they should go to England, if she hadn't wanted to work in a London shop, they wouldn't be caught in this trap they had made for themselves. Their children spoke with London accents. Patrick and Brendan worked for English firms and would make their homes in England. Patrick had married an English girl. They were Catholics and they had Irish names, yet home for them was not Waterford. Could you not make it up with Mr. Joyce, Dermot, she said. Could you go round with the tie and say you were sorry? Sorry? You know what I mean. In spite of herself, her voice had acquired a trace of impatience, an edginess that was unusual in it. She did not ever speak to him like that. It was the way she occasionally spoke to the children. But what would I say I was sorry for, Nora? For what you said that night? She smiled, trying to calm her agitation. He lit another cigarette, the flame of the match briefly illuminating his face. Nothing had changed in his face. He said, I don't think Mr. Joyce and I had any disagreement, Nora. I know, Dermot, she said, that you didn't mean anything. There was no disagreement, girl, he said. There had been no disagreement. But on that evening in August, something else had happened. On the 9 o'clock news, there had been a report of another outrage. And afterwards, when Dermot had turned the television off, there had been the familiar comment on it. He couldn't understand the mentality of people like that, Mr. Joyce said yet again. Killing just anyone, destroying life for no reason. Dermot had shaken his head over it, and she herself had said it was uncivilised. Then Dermot had added that they mustn't, of course, forget what the Catholics in the north had suffered. The bombs were a crime, but it didn't do to forget that the crime would not be there if generations of Catholics in the north had not been treated as animals. There'd been a silence then, a difficult kind of silence which she had broken herself. All that was in the past, she said hastily, in a rush. Nothing in the past or the present or anywhere else could ever justify the killing of innocent people. Even so, Dermot had added, it didn't do to avoid the truth. And Mr. Joyce had not said anything. I say there's no need for me to go round with the time, Nora, Dermot said. No, I'd say he'd make the effort on Christmas Day. Of course he won't, she said. Her voice was raised, with more than impatience in it now, but her anger was controlled. Of course he won't come, she said. It's a time for goodwill, Nora, he said. Another Christmas to remind us. He spoke slowly, the words prompted by some interpretation of God's voice in answer to a prayer, and she recognised that in his deliberate tone. It isn't just another Christmas, she said. It's an awful kind of Christmas. It's a Christmas to be ashamed, and you're making it worse, Dermot. Her lips were trembling in a way that was uncomfortable. If she tried to calm herself, she'd become jittery instead. She might even begin to weep. Mr. Joyce had been generous and tactful, she said loudly. It made no difference to Mr. Joyce that they were Irish people. Yet his generosity and his tact had been thrown back in his face. Everyone knew that the Catholics in the north had suffered, that generations of injustice had been twisted into the shape of a cause. But you couldn't say it to an old man who had hardly ever been outside Fulham in his life. And you couldn't say it because when you did say it, you sounded like an excuse for murder. You have to state the truth, Nora, he said. It's there to be told. Well, I never yet cared for a North of Ireland person, she said sharply. Catholic or Protestant, let them fight it out and not bother us. You shouldn't say that, Nora, he said. It's more of your truth for you. He didn't reply. There was the gleam of his face for a moment as he drew his cigarette. In all their married life, they had never had a quarrel that was in any way serious. Yet she felt herself now in the presence of a seriousness that was too much for her. She had told him that whenever a new bombing took place, she prayed it might be the work of any group that wasn't Irish. She told him that in shops she had begun to feel embarrassed because of her Waterford accent. He'd said she must have courage, and she realised now that he had drawn on courage himself when he had made that remark to Mr. Joyce. He would have prayed and considered before making it. He would have seen it in the end as his Catholic duty. He thinks you don't condemn people being killed. She spoke quietly, even though she felt a wildness inside her. She felt she should be out on the streets, shouting in her Waterford accent, violently stating that the bombers were more despicable with every breath they drew, that hatred and death were all they deserved. She saw herself on Fulham Broadway, haranguing the passers-by, her greying hair blown in the wind, her voice more passionate than it had ever been before, but none of it was the kind of thing she could do because she was not that kind of a woman. She hadn't the courage, any more than she had the courage to urge her anger to explode in their living room. For all the years of her marriage, there had never been the need of such courage before. She was aware of that, but found no consolation in it. "I think he's maybe seen it by now," Dermot said, "how one thing leads to another." And she felt insulted by the words. She willed herself the strength to shout, to pour out a torrent of fury at him, but the strength did not come. Standing up, she stumbled in the gloom and felt a piece of holly under the sole of her shoe. She turned the light on. "I'll pray that Mr. Joyce will come," he said. She looked at him, pale and thin, with his priestly face. For the first time since he had asked her to marry him in the Tara ballroom, she did not love him. He was cleverer than she was, yet he seemed half blind. He was good, yet he seemed hard in his goodness, as though he'd be better without it. Up to the very last moment on Christmas Day, there would be the pretense that their landlord would arrive, that God would answer a prayer because his truth had been honoured. She considered it hypocrisy, unable to help herself in that opinion. He talked, but she did not listen. He spoke of keeping faith with their own, of being a Catholic. Crime begot crime, he said. God wanted it to be known that one evil led to another. And she continued to look at him when he spoke, pretending to listen, but wondering instead if in 12 months' time, when another Christmas came, he would still be cycling from house to house to read gas meters, or would people have objected, requesting a meter reader who was not Irish. An objection to a man with an Irish accent was down to earth and ordinary by now. It didn't belong in the same category as crime begetting crime, or God wanting something to be known, or in the category of truth and conscience. But in the present circumstances, the objection would be understandable and fair. It seemed even right that it should be made, for it was a man with an Irish accent in whom the worst had been brought out by the troubles that had come, who was guilty of a cruelty no one would have believed him capable of. Their harmless elderly landlord might die in the course of that same year. A friendship he had valued lost, his last Christmas lonely. Grand though it might seem in one way, all of it was so petty. Once as a girl she might have cried, but her contented marriage had caused her to lose that habit. She cleared up the tea things, reflecting that the bombers would be pleased if they could note the victory they'd scored in a little living room in Fulham. And on Christmas Day, when a family sat down to a conventional meal, the victory would be greater. There would be crackers and chatter and excitement. The Queen and the Pope would deliver speeches. Dermot would discuss these Christmas messages with Patrick and Brendan as he discussed them in the past with Mr. Joyce. He would be as kind as ever. He would console Bridget and Cathal and Tom by saying that Mr. Joyce hadn't been up to the journey. And whenever she looked at him, she would remember the Christmases of the past, and she would feel ashamed of him and of herself.